Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
And the flowers are still standing.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten and I'm joined by Chad Gross. Greetings, Chad. How are you this week?
I am doing pretty well. I'm hanging in there.
Great. Well, let's hang out and have a great talk today. We've got a great guest, which we'll get to in just a moment or two. But I wanted to share with you, Chad, just an amazing book I read this past week. Another selection by philosopher Peter Kreeft.
Oh,
you want to guess what it is? He's got 60 books or something like that.
I was going to say that I don't think that would be like a very useful guess, but sure. You read his book on Aristotle.
No.
Dang it.
One of my favorite, if I had to choose one, you know how they say take a book with you on a desert island. Well, of course, I couldn't settle for just one book, but you just take a Kindle full of titles. Anyway, Pascal's Pensées is one of my favorite. I think it's brilliant. And of course, it's just a collection of his unfinished thoughts and sort of an outline of his apologetic that he was going to make, but never got a chance to because he died at 39. But, Pascal, he made basically the first computer, super smart in probability theory, mathematics, and that sort of thing. But he was also a Christian and a philosopher, was working on his apologetic book. So Peter Kreeft, he has a book called Christianity for Modern Pagans, Pascal's Pensées, edited, outlined, and explained. The thing about Peter Kreeft, I don't agree with him on everything, so don't anybody freak out. But he's amazing in his clarity and just the way he speaks, the way he explains things, the way he writes is just so beautiful. I mean, he truly is one of those philosophers who appreciates the good, the true, and the beautiful. And he's opened up the Pensées, opened up Pascal in such a way that was just so amazing. I mean, even the first few pages were like, yeah, I'm going to love this. And I did. It was a great book. So if anybody's into Pascal, you want to say skim off the top 1/3 of his best stuff, or maybe half, and then have Peter Kreeft kind of elaborate in between. It's really cool. And you see how the reason it's called Christianity for Modern Pagans is that Kreeft argues that the days we're living in now are sort of the days that Pascal was living in. People were indifferent. People didn't want anything to do with Christianity. They didn't see it being useful. And so they're apathetic. And so he's confronting them in order not just to persuade them intellectually, but to show that it's desirable, to show that it's beautiful, and then to show that it's true. And so it's really cool in the sense of showing how that approach might be something we can learn from. So very enjoyable read, highly recommended. I'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that since I've been reading and looking into apologetics and philosophy and things like that, is that sometimes philosophy or theology can come across as rather cold because it is merely focused on the question of whether it's true. And a lot of times when we read, even Lewis, like you can take Lewis for maybe more recent than Pascal, right? Somebody like that kind of has a more fully orbed approach.
Yes, fully orbed.
Yeah, I just had to get that word in there.
We got to get back to the fully orbedness.
But they have a fully orbed kind of approach where they not only present it as true, but of course, as you said, good and beautiful. And I think that's something we can learn from. Also, can I ask you a question about the book?
But of course.
So what? Thank you, Count. So is there a good chunk in there about the wager, like Pascal's wager?
Yeah, well, it doesn't come till the sort of the end because the way it's structured is
that makes sense.
To show, all of the things leading up to it, and like you should wager for God in that sense. And for anybody who doesn't like the wager, my first thought would be, have you read the Pensées?
The reason I'm asking is precisely what you just said, because whenever I hear both Christian and non-Christian, not all the time, but sometimes when they talk about what his wager is, I don't even recognize what they're saying. Like, I'm like, that's not Pascal's wager. What do you maybe we could do a podcast on Pascal's wager, like what it is and what it isn't.
Well, there's an author that has a book called Taking Pascal's Wager or something like that. And it's on my bookshelf. So we'll dig it up. We'll read it. We'll contact the author. If you're out there listening,
that'd be great.
We're coming for you. Now, we need to transition because if there's 2 books to recommend, that would be one. But the other one we want to recommend more this week is one that's recently released by Travis Dickinson. And it's called Logic and the Way of Jesus. So it just released in February 2022. It's a great book. Well, we've been talking a little bit about logic. We had awesome interview with Ken Samples talking about logic and that sort of thing. And so I'm on this quest for finding the best one book to suggest for people if they could only read one book about logic for Christians. I've read various logic books and some are like, oh, I don't want to sit here and do truth tables all day or, diagram things. But this is like combines a little bit of Moreland, a little bit of Willard, a little bit of worldview, and then takes you into logic, a little bit of the argument from reason, as you will elaborate on, I'm sure. And then he gives you solid textbook on logic and then sort of ties it all together and how it can be applied for Christians. So, wow. So far, this is my number one recommendation for logic books for Christians. So it's called Logic and the Way of Jesus. Author is Travis Dickinson, and he's here with us today. We'll talk a little bit more about his background here in a moment, but what are your thoughts on the book, Chad?
Yeah, well, I mean, I totally agree in the sense of like what a great introduction to logic, but also it goes beyond that, right? There were so many things in here, as I think I sent you a text maybe about as I was reading through the book. He hits on so many things that I kick around in my head that are very important to me. I loved the chapter that he talked about the argument from reason. I loved his formation of the argument. I'm excited to talk to him about that. Bringing back J.P. Moreland and Dallas Willard have been arguing for years that Jesus is the smartest man who ever lived, that Jesus was an intellectual, and we need to kind of rebaptize him, if you will, in the church as an intellectual. And that chapter on Jesus the logician was just wonderfully written. The discussion he has on inference to the best explanation, the role it plays in science, the role it plays outside of science. I loved the art of persuasion, the habits of Jesus that were persuasive, and also just how to have fruitful discussions. I mean, it's a great introduction to logic, but it also goes far beyond that. So I wrote a little mini review on Twitter. It says this. It says, Logic and the Way of Jesus by Travis Dickinson is some of the best work I've read in recent memory. He writes clearly on challenging philosophical topics without sacrificing intellectual rigor. Highly recommended.
Good stuff. And that bit that you're talking about towards the end, intellectual virtues and the art of persuasion, we've kind of kicked around this idea of, remember that post you wrote about characteristics of a mature thinker? It sort of echoes that sort of vibe, where the different qualities you want to have when you're, being charitable and those sorts of things. And so, highly recommended. So we're looking forward to talking to Travis Dickinson. He's the professor of philosophy at Dallas Baptist University. He's the author of Logic and the Way of Jesus and Everyday Apologetics, co-author of Stand Firm, Apologetics and the Brilliance of the Gospel. He's got a master's and a PhD in philosophy, an MA in philosophy of religion and ethics, and MA in Christian apologetics. Travis is a contributing writer for the Christian Research Journal and regularly speaks at churches and conferences. The inside leaf of the book says, in Logic and the Way of Jesus, philosopher Professor Travis Dickinson recaptures the need for a Christian view of reality, highlighting the use of reason and evidence to develop and defend Christian beliefs. He demonstrates how Jesus employed logic in his teachings, surveys the basic concepts of logic, and marries those concepts with practical application. He contends that Christians have failed to engage the culture deeply because they have failed to emphasize and value a Christian intellect. He offers encouragement that embracing the life of the Christian mind impact the world for the cause and kingdom of Christ. So you can check out more from Travis Dickinson at his website, travisdickinson.com. We'll link to all these things in the show notes. Without any further ado, let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
All right. Well, Travis Dickinson, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, for sure.
Chad and I have read your book. We've spent about 15 minutes talking about it before you got on here, basically saying, yeah, everybody go get this thing. It's great. So don't let us down now. Don't let us down.
Right. Yeah. What a gem, Travis. I absolutely love it. I had probably 2 or 3 as I was reading through your work. I had 2 or 3 kind of what I would call George Bailey moments from It's a Wonderful Life.
Okay.
You know, the yes, and I love there were so many points that I was loving. I love so many things I was telling Brian that you hit on in the book are things that I kick around in my head a lot. Yeah. And so I cannot recommend it enough. And I even told my girls, they're almost 14 and 15, actually turned 15 on Friday.
Nice.
I actually said to them, when you guys get a little older, because they're studying logic in school, but I said, when you guys get a little older, I said, this is one of the few books I've said to you, but I'm going to make you read this.
Okay.
You need to read this book. So
well, I appreciate that.
Absolutely,
That's awesome.
Absolutely love it.
That's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah, I have been trying to market it to high schools and, classical schools and that sort of a thing. Because I attempted, at least, I was trying to write it very accessibly, but also, in a sort of informed way. So, but I appreciate that.
Yeah, my girls are actually being classically educated.
Okay.
And so I took it to my wife. My wife is a classical, one of the tutors. And I took this book to my wife too. And I said, this needs to be required. You guys need to get this in the program. I said, this book's amazing.
Love it.
They're probably at this point, my family's seeing me walking around with the book being like, we got to avoid him. We got to avoid him, because.
Right.
Well, I know Chad's got a couple kids. I got 3. You've got 4. Okay. And so, I mean, I've been looking at your education and all these degrees you've got. And I'm thinking, where is he getting the time? Is each one of the kids doing a PhD for him? Tell us a little bit about your background and, how you got interested in the subject of logic and philosophy and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I definitely did not set out on this path. I didn't have a lot of direction in life and at a certain point. So at one point I knew I wanted to teach. I just didn't know what that would look like. And as I got the opportunity to teach, I was teaching in a Christian high school and was assigned the 12th grade Bible class and told the topic was apologetics. I knew what it was. I had a course or 2 that was relevant to it, but that was about it. And so it was one of these things where I dove in learning the material the night before I would be teaching the material, that kind of thing, and just found my own faith growing. And so knew that's what I wanted to do, just fell in love. And so went to Biola University and wanted to study with, at the time, that was pretty much the only place to get a master's degree in apologetics. I don't know, maybe a quarter of the way through the program, just knew that this wouldn't be enough. This wouldn't be all of it. And even had, JP Moreland's a sort of mentor figure for me. And it was a talk that he gave about loving God with all of your mind, and that I just knew I had to keep. And that's, in a lot of ways, it's the inspiration of the book. So we can talk about that more, I'm guessing. But I just told the Lord that I would keep going as long as he would open the doors. I was happy to go back to teaching Christian high school. And so the doors just kept opening, ended up going to, I re-upped for a second master's degree at Biola, this time in their seminary program, their Talbot Seminary, and then applied to a few PhD programs and got the PhD at University of Iowa. So,
very good.
I was just going to say that talk by J.P. Moreland, Loving God with All Your Mind, I heard him give that in Mount Airy, Maryland.
Okay.
And it was really interesting because I was reading philosophy and apologetics, and my wife was, kind of thinking like, oh, that's Chad's thing. She really didn't get it. And she listened to that on CD because I bought a copy of it, his talk.
Right. And
she called me on the phone and she said, Chad, I finally get it. I get it.
Well, I had it on cassette tape, but
yeah. So she understood the importance, the importance of apologetics from listening to that talk.
Yep.
Well, I want to ask about the structure of the book. First off, it seems very intentional to me. So I see it kind of like laying the foundation of a Christian call to the life of the mind. And you're showing how Jesus is an example to be followed in this regard. And you set a framework of looking at things through a worldview lens. and then an argument from reason. And then only then you get into the nuts and bolts of what you might find in like a traditional logic textbook. So I want to hear from you. What's the goal there besides making it like the perfect intro book for logic?
Well, that was the goal right there. Now, in my own journey, as I say, with guys like J.P. Moreland and Dallas Willard and others who are certainly the giants whose shoulders I'm standing on in writing this book, they pointed us to the fact that Jesus is a brilliant thinker. And so I think for me, it was just coming to that place to say, like, well, then clearly he should be a model for us in doing that sort of critical thinking and logical work, and seeing that as motivating this kind of study. In some ways, I think Christians have the most reason to dive into a study of logic and critical thinking precisely because of our Christian faith. But there's a lot of work to be done there, I think, in sort of making the case for Christians to dive into this kind of thing. So that's the early chapters are certainly aiming at that before we get into the nuts and bolts of it all. And then I try to end with a kind of sort of practical application of what this looks like in living these things out. Things like the art of persuasion and intellectual virtues and how to think of evidence and science and those sort of things as well.
One of the things you mentioned there, drawing on the work of Dr. Moreland in chapter 1 there, the intellectual pursuit of God, you point out that Christianity's lost a lot of its cultural influence. And I know I've heard John Mark Reynolds say, that we've kind of become cultural consumers instead of cultural creators like we used to be. And you argue that to stem the tide, we have to recover the ability to think critically and to think Christianly about all of life. Can you talk a bit about this cultural decline within Christendom and how we can combat it?
Yeah, so, right, and others do this far better than I'd be able to do right here, right now. But yeah, we've sort of lost this idea that faith and reason, I think of reason as a sort of tool, as a sort of complementary tool to faith. So you, of course, can have faith that's not rational and that's not reasonable. I might be trusting a friend that's let me down many, many times in the past. That kind of thing, like I'm placing my faith in him, even though I shouldn't. And that's kind of the point, is to say that faith, I think when understood properly, faith when it's good is faith when we have good reason to trust that person or that thing even. Could be a car, could be an airplane, could be a person. And so we've sort of just lost that. I think we've sort of divided our pursuits that way, where we've got our faith pursuits, our so-called sacred pursuits, and our secular pursuits. And I think that's a real shame. I think that's not the vision that Jesus gives us in Scripture, and it's not the Christian worldview. And so these things connect because it takes a lot of reflection. So if you think of the really giants of the Christian faith through history that have contributed to culture in various ways, they've done it in a very sort of reflective way. It takes thinking about your life, your pursuits, your discipline, your art, whatever the case may be, and thinking about it both critically, because I think you have to sort of make the connections, and then figure out what it is to do this Christianly. I think that takes, some considerable effort, but that's almost foreign, I think, to a lot of people today, to think that the Christian worldview would apply to everything, every ounce of our lives, every pursuit of our lives. I think Christian faith has something to say about it, but a lot of people just aren't either, thinking critically about faith issues and their Christian faith, that sort of thing, as well as they're not thinking Christianly about their pursuits.
Yeah, that's good. I think it reminds me of when Dallas Willard used to talk about how if Jesus is not the Lord of every area of your life, then how can you say he's the Lord of your whole life?
Right.
If there are certain areas that you're not giving him.
Right. He's really not Lord.
Yeah.
Travis, I can imagine someone listening and they're like, well, yeah, I agree with that. I agree that Jesus was smart and that, you can glorify and worship God with your mind. But, I'm not built that way. I am not someone who even has any interest in logic. That book's for somebody else. maybe what would you say to persuade them that, no, this is for you, even if you don't think, you don't even want to get into that. There's a real aversion, I think, in some people's minds when it comes to logic, like, no, I'm not Mr. Spock.
I think I got you. Part of it comes down to our design. I think that we are designed to know, to have knowledge, to think critically. So I want to be the quickest to say that doesn't mean everybody's designed to go into sort of academic pursuits. Not everybody is built for the classroom, and not everybody's honestly built to sort of take books and just, some people can ingest a book in a few days and get a lot out of it. And others of us, I would include myself, I'm a slow reader. It takes me a while to sort of just get my head around stuff, and I'm a processor and that sort of thing. And so there's just a wide range of ways in which this can look. But I think that we all are, in our very, sort of natures, designed to know. Because guys that I know that are maybe not going to darken the door of a classroom or, grad program or something like that are incredibly intelligent individuals. I mean, I have a number of guys sort of flashing through my mind right now, but it's more on, in the crafts or the trades and things like that. But it's, my goodness, their knowledge is incredible. And so I don't think that there's any of us that are just not designed to be intellectual or sort of having intellectual pursuits, though it can look really different. And so I think if we consider what Scripture is, I mean, we are a people of the book, and I don't think we have the option to not be intellectuals at all as it relates to our faith. Some of us, I think, have just grown far too, I don't want to say lazy, just sort of unmotivated. We don't have the urgency. We don't have the sort of, we don't see why we would need to, dig into these things and sort of think critically about Scripture, about our faith, and so on. But my goodness, it's the most rewarding pursuit, I think, that there is in these areas. And so, yeah, I think that's right. I think there might be some people who think critical thinking is for the, I have a nice alliteration for this, the professor, the pastor, or the large brain parishioner. Impressive, right? Baptists love alliteration. So yeah, it's not. Critical thinking is for all of us, and we all use it. We use it to get out of bed in the morning. We use it to get to work. We use it for our jobs. We use it to do our taxes. We do it. I mean, it's all the time that we're using it. The question is just how well we will use our critical thinking skills. And then I think the big question on top of that, which is what I'm after in this book, is to say, what does it look like to do these things Christianly as we've thought about them?
Yeah. Considering that makes, I think that's why your book is sort of set apart in that sense. That it doesn't just dive right in, but it does make that case so that someone just picking it up, it doesn't plunge you into the deep end. It draws you in and encourages you.
Right.
And I think the way that you go about the nuts and bolts, if you were, in that sort of section, it's accessible. I've read my share of ones that are just like, we're going to start with truth tables, and it's like, oh man,
yes.
Wait, back up, and you're halfway through the first page, and you think, how much of this math am I going to do?
Right,
so.
Right. Yeah, and some of it does. In the book, at least, I do some formal stuff, but it's at a minimum, and it's very much trying to be very accessible and has no sort of prerequisites. Like I said, high schools are looking at picking this up as a textbook. I even had one school that said that they do their logic course. It's a classical school in Dallas. They do their logic course in 8th grade. So I don't know if they'll pick it up or not, but they're looking at it anyway. So don't be shown up by an 8th grader, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of those things that, Brian talking about, what about the Christian who says, well, I'm not really built that way. I don't think that way. I'm not interested in these things. Well, I was thrilled to see that you dedicated an entire chapter to Jesus as a logician, because this is often overlooked by Christian and skeptic alike. Yes. And I think that kind of breeds that view of, well, this isn't really my thing. And I think to myself, well, but if you're claiming to follow Jesus, that was part of his life.
That's right.
So can you speak to why it's important to not only acknowledge Jesus's moral virtue, and obviously that he's Lord, but also that Jesus was a very brilliant thinker?
Yes. So often I think the concern is, well, look, Jesus is omniscient. So of course he's brilliant, right? And there's no way you or I, any of us are going to measure up to that. So I guess we leave it to the pastor, professor, and large brain parishioner. But look, I think that Jesus is also omnibenevolent. I mean, he's perfectly good. And so I don't think the excuse that he's perfect gets us out of living good moral lives any more than it should get us out of given the fact that he's omniscient, should get us out of the intellectual pursuits.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So Jesus, if you think of Jesus's ministry, crowds followed. He was often in this way, just having just throngs of people sort of gather where he was. And we think that's because, well, yeah, like he's healing people, he's providing a free lunch, breaking bread and multiplying the fishes and the loaves, all that sort of thing. And people did come to see that. There's no doubt about it. But more often than not, it was not the miracles. It was actually his teaching, where it's this refrain that I really actually didn't realize till I really sort of dug into it, how often it says that the people were astonished. And again, sometimes they're astonished at the signs and wonders, but often it's his teaching. They just didn't know where it was coming from. They didn't know how he could be such an educated person, having, grown up in a very common sort of way. But he's rubbing elbows he's sort of matching logic for logic with the religious elites of his day, like the religious scholars. He's unmatched. They absolutely come at him with logical conundrums and challenges and that sort of thing. And Jesus finds no equal amongst them as he refutes them with logic oftentimes, right? And again, Jesus is always going to be a hard act to follow for any of us, and the disciples included. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't, again, as you put it, I think I say in the book, is when I was in high school is when WWJD came out. Right? What would Jesus do? And everybody was wearing these colorful bracelets and things like that. But right, that should be in the fullest sense. We should say not only what would he do, but how would he think of these things, and how should I think of these as a Christian?
Amen.
And sort of pursue these things both critically and of course Christianly. So
yeah, Travis, one of the verses that you're referring to that I absolutely love is in Matthew 22, when Jesus kind of goes at it with the Sadducees, then he goes at it with the Pharisees. And then 22:46 says, and no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions.
Because of the logical display. Like they kept getting embarrassed in a way. And so it was truly from his intellect that they didn't want to step up again. That had not gone well repeatedly.
Sure. And at least anybody that is listening think that we're not at all asserting or implying, and Travis actually does the exact opposite of this in the book. Nobody's trying to say that's the goal, is to embarrass people. But the idea is that what that passage is displaying, among other things, is just how astute and intelligent Jesus was, that these were kind of the religious scholars of the day. And they're walking away going, man, we got to stop asking them questions because it's making us look really bad.
And they were no mere questions. They were clear in the text that they were aiming to embarrass Jesus, basically, or really shame Jesus in some ways.
Right. Catch
him in these problems, theological problems, or get him to say something that was heresy, perhaps, something like that. And so it was never when they were just asking honest questions, right? It was just when they were coming up against Jesus to really try to shame him in some ways.
Right. That's a great point.
Yeah. Chapter 4. Now, we could go into the nuts and bolts of what's a syllogism and all of this sort of thing, but that's not podcast material.
Read the book. Read the book.
I know. I wondered if there'd be a opportunity to do an Audible, but I was kind of thinking, how would that even work, to do an Audible book with truth tables and syllogisms and the rest of it? But maybe.
That can be tricky. Right. So in chapter 4, you talk about the argument from reason.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to ask a Trinity question, which is one question, but has 3 parts. And so you don't know if it's 3 or 1.
Okay.
So the argument from reason, what is it Why include it? And can you unpack it?
Yes, yes, and yes.
So that's one question.
By the way, Travis, real quick.
Yes.
This is one of my favorite arguments that I think is really underused.
Yes.
And I love your formation of it. Love it.
Well, thanks. Appreciate that. Yeah. There's been some focus on it in sort of pretty technical, philosophical sense. Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga has sort of put some focus on it, but it really gets at it in a different sort of way. In regards to the three questions, the argument from reason does what a lot of arguments for God's existence do. It sort of points at a certain phenomena in the world that is meant to be, self-evident might be a little strong, but evident, an obvious fact of reality, and then asks, how do you explain this? So something like the moral argument for God's existence would point at moral facts and say, how do you explain the existence of moral facts? And of course, it's aiming to say that God well explains this, or the fine-tuning of the universe. That's a fact of reality that's, well-established scientific fact. And we're aiming to explain that, and it seems only well explained by God. Similarly, you can take the argument from reason and say, okay, well, what about logical principles? How do we explain the existence of those? And so that's what it is. Why is it included? Well, it's part of that earlier section where I'm motivating a study of logic and critical thinking. And here I agree with Chad, actually, that for me, this argument, I think, is very underappreciated, and it's really powerful. In fact, I may be willing to say it's the most powerful argument for God's existence in a way. So why include it is because it shows that the Christian worldview, again, well explains this phenomena, the phenomena of logic. And so that, again, as Christians, we should be the most motivated in a way, right? Because we have good reason to think that these things, namely logical principles, exist, and God's the best ground of them. So, okay, then the third question is, can I unpack it? Okay, here's the basic argument. I kind of go from two possibilities. So if logical principles exist, I think they are a problem for atheistic worldview. And I say it that way for a particular reason. It's sort of popular these days for atheists to say that atheism isn't a worldview, that it's, just the lack of a belief in God and that sort of thing. And I don't think that's probably the right way to think of atheism, but I can concede that to say, even if you think atheism is a mere lack of belief, you still have a worldview. And so that worldview is either going to deny anything beyond the natural world, that would be the naturalistic worldview or the worldview of naturalism, or it's going to say that, yeah, there is a world beyond the natural world, but it's sort of Plato's heaven, a sort of Platonistic view that says moral facts, logical facts, these sorts of things exist beyond, this sort of space-time world, that sort of thing. Something to that effect. I mean, these are broad brushstrokes because, again, it's meant to be, there's a very technical discussion. I try to leave that out of it. The problem with naturalism is that it seems to deny logical principles straight away, because logical principles, if we think about it, are not like natural things. So they're not like a tree in the forest or something. A tree in the forest is going to have a specific location. It's a physical thing. It's got a location. It's got dimensions and so on. And logical principles are clearly not like that. Logical principles are arguably necessary truths, which is to say that they can't be false, right? It's not an empirical matter. It's not the way the world was created. They just seem to be necessarily true. Again, no matter if you're, on the tip of Mount Everest or at the bottom of the ocean or on Mars, the principle of non-contradiction, for example, is going to be true. And it doesn't matter if we're talking 1,000 years ago or 1,000 years from now. Like, it's always okay. So it's necessary truth. It's an eternal truth. It's a non-physical thing, because I don't even know what it would mean to say that the principle of non-contradiction is a physical thing. And so we're sort of, if we think of naturalism just doesn't seem to have a space for something like a genuine logical principle. But here comes the really big problem. This is, of course, C.S. Lewis makes this point in a couple places, but the sort of self-defeating nature of denying logical principles, right? It's sort of like if you just say, okay, what are your reasons for denying logical principles? You're kind of caught in a problem there, because you would have to try to give a logic for why logic doesn't exist. And that's, of course, self-defeating. So I tell my students, like, this is one of those cases in which it's like saying, right, I speak no English and I say that in English. I've refuted myself, right? This is what we call being self-refuting, in the same way that if you say with using logic that there is no such thing as logic, you've refuted yourself there in a really bad way. So it doesn't seem like that's an option that's available to us. And again, the irony here is that a lot of atheists, they really revere reason, right? And I think they genuinely do. I think that a lot of atheists would say that they are atheists precisely because of reasons. And I'm not actually calling that into question at all. I think they probably do have their reasons, right? Some of them, maybe it's the problem of evil or something like the problem of hiddenness, something to that effect. And these are the reasons why they don't believe. What I'm calling into question is whether or not their worldview can ground reason or not. And it doesn't look like the naturalistic worldview can, the worldview of naturalism can. It doesn't seem to make space for a genuine logical principle. So then the move is to go to the Platonism, where one just says, yes, logical principles exist, but they're outside space and time. They're beyond the natural world and so on. So it's clearly this is not a naturalistic view, right? And so the problem here, though, is it seems ad hoc. It's, something that's ad hoc is when you have when a claim, right? This is in the fallacies chapter, by the way, but when a claim lacks independent reason for believing it. So it may explain the data in some ways, but there's no independent reason to think. It's sort of like if I were to, drop my pencil right now on the floor, and if I were to say, I know why that happened. It was little fairies flew up there, grabbed the pencil, and drug it down to the floor. Now, that's an explanation. It does actually explain the data. It just does it in an ad hoc way. There's no independent reason to think that there are little fairies and so on. And I think the same way with saying that something like the principle of non-contradiction just exists is ad hoc. There's no reason other than the fact that it makes sense of why we use the principle of non-contradiction in all of our thinking. And again, it's just ad hoc. So I also think that it's super odd to think that the principle of non-contradiction just exists out there, right? I don't even know how to think of that. People say this kind of thing. I mean, philosophers will say this kind of thing, but I just don't know how to think of that. And so I think the principle of non-contradiction is best understood as a property of a mind. That's kind of our only interaction with it is as a sort of mental property, or a probably better put, as a property of the mind. And so if you have that, then we're kind of led to say, okay, well, if we're trying to explain something that is necessary, eternal, otherworldly, non-physical, and we need a mind to explain it, you just kind of put those things together. And I think we're just, talking about God at that point. So that by trying to truly ground logical principles, I think it's extraordinary that we're led to the divine mind.
Mm-hmm. As you say, it appeals to those who value reason, because they do have to account for that. How much more so if they value that so highly? It's not right, and it's not something from history where you can argue endlessly over different evidences. There doesn't seem to be a lot of choices, options to throw out there, other than the ad hoc stuff that you're saying.
It's also with the moral argument. I think the moral argument for God's existence is a very powerful argument as well. A naturalist could deny the existence of moral facts. You know what I mean? Like it could be the case that there just are no moral facts, that we just evolved. These things just evolved as sort of social practices and so on. But that move, I mean, I think that's a bad move there too, obviously, right? I mean, somebody could do it, but I'm going to sort of keep one hand on my wallet and not let them around my kids if they don't think that moral facts exist.
And also it's very unlikely that they actually live in such a way that they believe
that's right.
there are no moral
that's
facts.
Right. Absolutely.
That's a whole other point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you could do that though on the moral argument. I think that's a huge bullet to bite, but that's something that of course many naturalists do. They do make that move, but I don't think that's available on the argument from reason, because then there's that self-defeat in trying to deny the existence of logical principles or logical facts.
I have to say that one of I mentioned early in the podcast, my George Bailey, yes moments was your formulation of the argument from reason. Because like I said, I love that argument. So I want to read the premises of your argument and then ask you a question.
Okay.
So for listeners, I feel like I've built this up so much that you've got to hear it. So premise 1, if God does not exist, then either logical principles do not exist, naturalism, or they exist as brute abstract objects, which is Platonism, which Travis unpacked. Premise 2, it's not the case that logical principles do not exist because this is self-defeating. It's not the case that they exist as brute abstract objects, since this is ad hoc, therefore God exists. So my question for you would be, what would be, kind of put on your skeptical hat, if you will, what would be kind of the best objection that you could come up with to your argument?
I think if I was, for whatever reason, convinced that God doesn't exist, if there were these other, reasons that convinced me of that, I would go the Platonist route.
Same.
Yeah, I think that's a far more, I just could not stomach myself denying something like moral facts and these sort of logical facts or logical principles. And again, it's not just a matter of stomaching it, but it's that it would be radically self-defeating it again. And you are denying that thing that supposedly has motivated your view. And again, not necessarily supposedly, but just has motivated your view. Like it's the logic of something like the problem of evil or one of these other arguments that has led you to that view. You're having to deny. I mean, that's such an awkward position. You're having to deny the very thing that led you there. So I think that's what one would have to do. And I think that's what I would do if I were to become convinced that God doesn't exist. And I think the best sort of way to go about it would be to just say, appeal to mystery or something and just say, yes, it's a little odd that these things just exist outside space and time. But since we know, I think that, it'd probably just be something like, since we know that God doesn't exist and we know that logical principles do exist, that's all we are left with. Yeah. You mentioned in your book,
I mean, I know we're crossing wires here a bit with the moral argument and the argument from reason.
Yeah.
But you mentioned in your book, Wielenberg's, kind of moral Platonism. I know it's more sophisticated than that, but I'm just trying to keep it simple.
Yep.
So it would almost be similar to that of like, look,
yes,
we know these things exist. And so here's where we're going to land.
Yes, that's right. Something like, since we're convinced that God does not exist and we're convinced that logical principles do exist, you're just sort of left with the Platonism. What are these? Okay. How it all works out? How could a logical principle just exist? Well, we know that it does. So I don't know. I think it would have to be something of an appeal to mystery.
Okay, that's helpful. So in chapter 10, this was another, I'm sorry, I keep going back to this. This is another George Bailey moment. Yeah. I'm excited to ask you this question. You did a great job explaining exactly what it means to reason abductively, how this type of reasoning is a central part of doing science. However, often I see skeptics accuse Christian thinkers of kind of, when they're reasoning abductively, they accuse us of the God of the gaps reasoning. So can you unpack for us what it means to reason to the best explanation or reason abductively, and whether or not the theist is indeed committing the God of the gaps fallacy when they argue like that?
Okay, yeah, good. So to reason abductively, or what's often called inference to the best explanation, I mean, I really have, I'm convinced that this is really how we go about a lot of life. We have some, phenomena that's before us that we, just as curious creatures, we begin to think about and sort of postulate almost immediately how to best explain it. So it's everything down, as mundane as just trying to figure out where our keys are, where we've left our keys to the car or whatever, or trying to understand if there is in fact a God. And then, of course, things like court cases, and these are almost always going to be perfect examples of reasoning abductively. So it goes something like this. What we do is we have some sort of phenomena that we come on that we're curious about, that we're trying to explain, and we will postulate. Again, we don't use these words and we don't always even do it reflectively, but we're trying to explain the world as it comes to us. And so we will consider, sometimes it's causal, sometimes it's like, what has caused this? And so I think in the book, I use the example of sitting in your front yard. And this is in part because I was writing the book in my front yard, and we got some trees out there. So you're sitting in your front yard and you see a tree fall. That's a bit of an odd thing. And so you're going to immediately start to wonder why that happened. And you don't go to something like, well, space aliens must have like zapped the tree or invisibly zapped the tree or something like that. And it's because that thesis, that theory lacks what we call theoretical virtues. Whereas what you will almost certainly think is that the tree had rotted out, or some sort of insect infestation, that's what I'm trying to say, that weakened the tree and it fell down. That theory displays arguably more theoretical virtues. For one, it's simpler to postulate the existence of space aliens. Seems to be a far more complex view than just say the tree had sort of rotted out or whatever, right? It also brings up other theoretical virtues, such as the theoretical virtue of conservatism, which says that a theory is a good one if it accords with other things that we know. So again, we don't have knowledge of space aliens, and we don't think that they're probably interested in the trees in my front yard. And so thinking that the tree just sort of rotted out, got weakened and fell, that's more conservative, and so on. And we do these sort of, we spot, so to speak, or discern, might be a better word, theoretical virtues of those very, very plausible theses that we do in fact believe. Okay, and so then you asked about the God of the gaps. So when it comes to God, I think we do the same thing. I think we have an extraordinary amount of facts about the world that are odd in a way, that are just call for explanation. Things like the fine-tuning. I even think things like the existence of the universe itself, the existence of reality, calls for explanation, right? Because it certainly seems to be the case that there could have been nothing, but there's actually something. And so we can ask that question of what best explains that phenomena, and on through. And so it's not a God of the gaps, because it's really predicated on what we in fact know, right? So a God of the gaps argument typically says, you Christians just have a gap in your knowledge, and then what you do is you just sort of plug God into any gap that we have. It might feel that way, but I don't think that that's what we're doing. What we're doing is just like you would do in a court case, or like the example of the tree in my front yard or whatever. We are trying to ask what's the best explanation of the variety of facts that we're attempting to explain. And so this is why we can zero in on particular arguments like the moral argument, or the argument from reason, or the Kalam cosmological, or the fine-tuning, and so on. And I don't think any of these individually are a kind of slam dunk. You just couldn't possibly think of any reason to object to it. I think there are objections to each of these arguments in some ways, but really where the force comes in is the cumulative force of all these arguments put together. When you start understanding that not only would God is the best explanation of, say, logical principles, but he's also the best explanation of moral facts, and he's the best explanation of why there's a universe at all, and he's the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. And we can just kind of keep going here. The best explanation of consciousness and the best explanation of beauty in the world and so on. All of it sort of comes together and we realize, man, this single thesis, based on what we know we need in an explanation, that's the reason to posit God. So it's really quite the opposite of just sort of plugging God into the gaps.
Yeah, that's well said. And I like the point about how inference to the best explanation, or the method of competing hypotheses, if you want to call it that, is essentially arguing from what we do know, where God of the gaps is saying, well, we don't know, therefore God, which those are obviously, hopefully the charitable person could see how those are very different. I also like how you subtly bring out in the chapter, though, that if you're going to object to that type of reasoning, then you're going to be undermining much of what science does. And I think that's right. A powerful point, too.
Yeah, right. This is just a very familiar way in which we reason, and this is really the way in which the scientist reasons.
Yeah.
Again, it's not calling into question that someone might sort of look to science, and that might be why they feel inclined and compelled to, their atheistic views or whatever. But the question is, one, again, going back to the argument from reason, if that's well grounded, but I think too, like, take that very same methodology, and I think you can approach God from that same sort of starting place to say, like, we're just looking around at these facts, and now it's a little different because, we're not doing this in a lab, and we're not, it's not going to be, scientific experimentation and that sort of a thing. This is philosophical, theological topics. Absolutely. So if somebody has no space for philosophy and theology, then they're going to struggle here. But I think that they ought to, because I think, again, it's a very mundane thing. That's why I say it doesn't require us to go to a master's and PhD program to be able to be an intellectual Christian. It really just takes looking out at the world. It's easy to spot design. It's easy to spot fine-tuning, I think. Right? I mean, some of it gets very technical, and that's what I love about it, is that there is something for everybody. So that person who doesn't have the training to really understand, like, the cosmological constant and the strong nuclear force and all these that, I don't know anything about those things either. So you're in good company, I guess, in a way. But look, I mean, I can just look out my window and I see all kinds of design and extraordinary things that don't seem like they could just come about by chance. It seems, and I think this is why so many people throughout history have believed in God, is that it has just presented itself as the best explanation for the phenomena that we see.
Well put.
Yes. Well, Travis, you include a chapter about, and it's entitled Intellectual Virtues and the Art of Persuasion. So yes. In there, you talk a bit about how to be intellectually virtuous, and I'm going to focus on the topic of persuasion. Maybe you could talk a bit about persuasion for Christians and how being a better thinker, using their minds, can help them to be more effective in being persuasive as Christians.
So I think that one of the best ways to be persuasive is to actually ask good questions. I mean, this is a big deal for me. I actually have a book that will be out in the fall that talks about doubts and big questions and things like that. So the title is Wandering Toward God. But in any case, I think that questions are important for us in thinking critically about our own faith, but also asking good questions as we approach people that we're talking with. Because what it tends to do is, we've all watched these debates, William Lane Craig or whoever, and Bill Craig's a mentor figure for me as well. But right, and I've heard Bill say that he's not trying to persuade the person that he's debating. He's really trying to, if anything, persuade the people in the audience. I just don't think these formal debates are typically persuading anyone, or at least very many people, because we kind of have our views and then we want our guy to win and everybody declares whoever's their guy the winner. But what I want to imagine is us sitting down with a cup of coffee or whatever and just having a discussion with someone. I think that's actually far more persuasive or has the possibility of being persuasive, when we're just sitting down and saying, okay, so you don't think that God exists. Okay, well, tell me why. And then they might say something, and you just sort of ask questions and just engage in a thoughtful discussion. I think that's often far more persuasive than certainly getting on the sort of soapbox situation, and you're proclaiming your side right, and one person says God exists and the other person says God doesn't exist, and you kind of go back and forth on it. I just don't think there's a lot of persuasion going on there. I would far rather have a discussion with someone.
That's a good point, and you sort of helped me transition, because my next question was actually going to be, you have this book coming out in October, Wandering Toward God, so maybe you could give a little teaser for that, talk about what other elements you discuss in there.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this one too, and in some ways it does connect up with this book, the Logic book. The Logic book is definitely probably going to find most of its readers in a classroom, being assigned as a textbook. I think it's a book that anybody can read, but definitely has sort of the classroom in mind in some ways. Whereas the next book is, Wandering Toward God, Finding Faith Amid Doubts and Big Questions. And so I'm really excited about it. It's written as a trade book. It's meant to be completely accessible and just to act as a sort of guide for us as we ask the deep and difficult questions. I say there that it's going to almost certainly, if we ask the deep and difficult questions with an honest mind and an honest heart, I think we're probably going to experience a little doubt as we go. I think that's just very natural for us. And rather than seeing doubt as a kind of problem or sin or something like that, what I say there is that I don't want anybody to doubt. I mean, it's not like it's my goal or aim, and I don't think it's a good in itself. But I think it does have value because it, as we sort of lean into those doubts, I think what you find is truth, even if you change your mind on something, right? So if you're having some doubts about, a political candidate or your sports team or whatever it may be, like it's probably worth leaning into those and sort of exploring those. And I think same with faith. It's, if you're having some doubts, lean into that and see where you end up. I have found, so I've definitely been someone who has doubted my faith before. And it was extraordinary because I was scared, and it was like I didn't feel like I felt like maybe I was doing something wrong. And as I leaned in, what I just kept finding were answers and more answers. And it was sort of like I sort of moved from believing it was true, and I believed because it was true, or at least because I had reasons to think it was true. And that was really important for me. And so that's kind of what I'm doing in that book.
Cool.
Sounds great. So imagine there's a listener right now who's hearing what you're saying, and they're hungry for this. They're thinking, yes, I want to think both. I want to think critically. I want to think Christianly about all of life. But they look around their church, and it just seems that the life of the mind is either neglected or it's ignored entirely. What would be your encouragement to them?
Yeah, and that's probably a reality for a lot of people, unfortunately. I think that you either end up having to find that community somewhere. And I think that, there's of course some people that probably live in remote areas where this is less accessible than someone that's living in a bigger city or whatever, but is finding community groups of some sort or other of like-minded folks that want to think about these things. There's a number of groups here. I'm in the DFW area, Dallas-Fort Worth area, and there are a number of like Christian atheist groups that are just meeting together to sort of sit down and think and talk about these things. And those are really helpful. And there's a number of, different groups like Ratio Christi and the Reasonable Faith chapters around that I think provide that opportunity. And so I think unfortunately, like I lament the fact that that's all too common in our churches, that it's hard to find people who are like-minded that you can do that. But so I think it takes probably a little pursuit for that person to find that. And it might end up being a online Facebook group or, something to that effect. But hopefully people can find it somewhere. And if not, I think that, I guess what I would want to say is it might be the case that that person needs to start the group. and begin to, maybe just buy a case of my book and pass it out to people. No, I'm kidding. But right, just get that. I mean, start a group where you sell the idea of thinking critically about your faith and that this is a good thing, and start to build that community yourself. Because I wish it was the case that every church had this, but right, maybe one day we'll get there. But right now, it's going to be up to a lot of us to catch this vision, and because of our love and wanting to make Jesus Lord over everything, even our intellectual pursuits, that we would start our own groups.
Well put.
Thanks, Travis. I want to point our listeners to Travis's website, travisdickinson.com. Thank you so much for your time, Travis. And we want to commend your book, of course, like we've been doing incessantly on the podcast here. But what other sort of resources or anything that you would want to point our listeners to before we sign off?
Pretty much anything by Dallas Willard to start. But, The Divine Conspiracy and others are sort of his classics. J.P. Moreland's book, again, Love the Lord Your God with All Your Mind, is just a really important book. And it's one that I know a lot of guys that have gone like me all the way through to the PhD and, landed an academic job. That was the book that sort of started the journey for a lot of us. And so, and again, you don't have to go the whole academic route to get a lot out of the book. They're starting to be, I think we just have so many people writing in apologetics these days that is everything from very, very advanced to down to books that you can give your kids and everything in between. And so there really is just so many opportunities. And by the way, I don't think it's just apologetics. I think that people should follow their interests. And so if your interest, say, is, like theology or Old Testament studies or archaeology, it's not going to be everybody's thing to do philosophy or apologetics even. And so just understand that we all have our interests, and I think those are often, in a way, God-given in a way, and we should pursue those things. And so look around to see who are people doing work in your area of interest, and really challenge yourself to read books that are hard. Again, everything in between. I think there's just a lot of opportunities there.
Super. Well, that wraps up our interview. Thanks again for being with us, Travis, and wishing you all the best, and love to talk to you again when your next book comes out.
All right, Brian and Chad, I really appreciate the opportunity and look forward to that.
Yes.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.